The X-15 was like a stallion, I'll tell you. It was going to kill me, or we were in a Mexican standoff for a while. People say, how were you chosen to be a rocket pilot? I wasn't chosen, I chose myself. That's what I was going to do, and I won my spurs. So did other guys, a lot more. I mean, I wasn't alone in doing that.
Here at Edwards Air Force Base, September 17, 1959 is a historic date. Early on this Thursday morning, the B-52 carrier takes the X-15 out for its maiden powered flight.
Hydraulic temperature, Scott. -2, and holding since we passed the tower.
Test pilot Scott Crossfield is buckled in and ready for a ride to 40,000 feet, where he'll be cut loose for the first demonstration of this plane's abilities and performance. Flying chase will be Al White, North American's alternate, Joe Walker, NASA's chief test pilot, and the Air Force project pilot, Major Bob White. All vital observers today. They'll be at the controls of the X-15 in the near future. Ground crews climb in a variety of vehicles and stream out to wait for landing at the edge of the lake bed. Many eyes are on the dark-shaped plane this morning, but among the most important observers are the engineers at NASA. Using the ears of radio and the eyes of radar, they'll keep a close watch on the flight. FM signals transmitted will indicate the condition of each vital operating system. Each movement will be carefully plotted, carefully watched.
003, Edwards, cleared for takeoff.
Winds 220 degrees at 12 knots.
Prime responsibility for getting the X-15 to drop altitude rests on the aircraft commander, Captain Charles Bach, and the co-pilot, Captain Allaby.
Any tower, 003, rolling now.
As the bomber climbs out, the litany of checkout drones on, item after item. Gauge, switch, and control are checked and rechecked. In the dim interior of the 52, Bill Berkowitz, launch monitor, has a close-up television view of system operation. The group has been this route before. 2 tries, 2 misses. The first try never left the ground. The second came agonizingly close, just 3 minutes from a drop, when a frozen valve canceled the effort. Delays are difficult to accept, but each time the system at fault was improved and a problem eliminated.
Here's coming on now. Number 3. Ready. 2 on now. Real slow to pick up hydraulic pressure.
Blake, how about it? It's a little slow, but it's up to speed now.
It dropped off in about 5 seconds, and it did go over 3,600. All flat, 510 on the tank.
3 knots to drop.
Flying to jettison. Blue on jettison. No jettisoning. Okay, good check. Prime's going on now. 6 now, Prime. Watch out there, can't see it. Yeah, I got, you got a blossom on the bottom one? Two, they're both looking good. 30 seconds, getting ready to launch right. It'll launch right on. Launch right on, master.
How about it, Blake? Think we're okay? Okay? All right, by me, let's go. Okay, Scott, let's give it a try.
Okay, Scotty, you ready? I'm ready with you, my buddy. Okay, here we go with the countdown. 3, 2, 1, release. Speed up and going.
Roger.
Heading uphill at 33,000 feet.
Roger.
Get across the board. And I'm on number 1 and climb 235.
Roger.
Excellent, good, guys. Right on, you look real good. Okay, fine. Up on 50. Level.
Roger. The course for this flight is a giant rectangle around the lake, climbing to the north, then making a left turn to a westerly heading, and leveling off at 52,000 feet.
See a little speed, and ease off.
Roger.
Left turn. Right. I'm beginning to come around the final part of the turn. I dropped back at Mach number.
The record showed Mach 2.1, over twice the speed of sound, 1,385 miles an hour.
Run out. Raj.
On the first try, man and plane went 1/3 the way to the goal of 6 times the speed of sound. As the X-15 slows to subsonic speeds, the chase planes catch up and the glide portion of the flight begins. Now on a southerly heading, Crossfield begins his long glide to landing from 46,000 feet. Time in the air is precious, and the checkout continues all the way down.
Roll part. Steady side foot. Very powerful rudder.
Got petrol?
Okay, buddy, just a second. 8,000. I want to drop it on the track. Here comes control now. You ready? Now, parachute. You're fouled up. Roger. You're fouled up? No, the parachute. Well, it's open, so letting it down. How nice. 245. Let's put your crosswind in it. 240. No, 240. Here is coming down out at Dixon. Nice and easy, Daddy. Short to town.
Maiden flight, a success. Today, flight research took another significant step forward here at Rogers Dry Lake. This lake bed has witnessed many significant events in the history of aviation. Born this day was a new tool for flight research. Using a new machine to probe into the unknown calls for caution, and weeks later the second flight showed that the performance could be repeated and excelled. Digesting the knowledge from these first tries, the program became more ambitious, and another step up the ladder was planned, one that would extend the operating area. Countdown for powered flight begins at midnight. The previous week has seen many test hurdles, each one met and overcome, each one establishing with greater authority the right of the X-15 to be in this fueling area. All the control points have been passed this far, And now the touchy, toxic, volatile propellants are added one by one. As tanks are gradually filled, crew members take long last looks into the vitals, then close the doors. Dawn finds the service cots being pulled away, with the two aircraft again standing ready. Even the most carefully controlled experiment has its element of risk, and the sober faces of every member of the team reflect their concern. Each research flight has fresh new goals. Each one is a cautious step forward into unexplored areas. The intention of this flight is to make a straight climb to 80,000 feet, hitting Mach 2 at the peak. The now routine checks of plane and engine pass uneventfully, and just past 9 in the morning, the third voyage of the X-15 begins. Trouble came in pairs on this day. The engine failure was complicated by a structural break, and both were at this time unexplained. The plane was on the ground, the pilot safe, but there were new problems. Investigators found that the rocket engine had suffered an ignition failure, leaving a chamber loaded with explosives. When this mixture finally ignited, the chamber ruptured. This explosion triggered another series of events leading to additional damage. Under normal conditions, the tanks are almost emptied, but jettison in a nose-down emergency glide leaves more propellants, more weight in the fuselage. Because of this increased weight, the nose of the plane had to be higher than usual during landing. Although the touchdown was smooth, the nose-up angle was beyond the design limits, and the break occurred when the nose wheel slammed to the ground. A day and a half after the accident saw the airframe in its original jigs at the factory. The damage that seemed crippling was quickly repaired, and the broken halves rejoined. This whole project is one set to gain knowledge, and even from failures, lessons are learned. The fuselage was strengthened and landing gear was redesigned to absorb more shock. The rocket engines were modified to increase reliability. 5 weeks after the unsuccessful try, the plane, now whole and improved, began its trek back to Edwards Air Force Base. Weeks have slipped by since the accident, but the time has been traded for knowledge. More is known now. Certain hazards have been ruled out. The machine is better, more able. This is the #1 plane of the series, modified, improved, and set to show its capabilities. It hangs frosted, smoking, ready. Come back in, and they left all the way across the floor. Back in, Miss Auto, again. Pouring on the rocket power, the X-15 streaks to a new high of Mach 2.5, 1,660 miles an hour at 67,000 feet. January saw the number one airplane make its final qualifying flight. Delivery to the Air Force and NASA started a new crew on acceptance check and pre-flight readying. Joe Walker, chief research pilot of the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, was the first to show that the X-15 is not a one-man airplane. At this time, 2 X-15s were flight ready. Number 1 was involved in the Air Force NASA program to take the airplane with its present engines and push it to the limit of its abilities. And Joe Walker's first flight denotes the start of this research phase. The number 2 plane was still being flown by North American for investigation of stability, control, flying qualities.
Okay, that's nice. You're going a little to the right now. I would say that's okay. Okay, we got all 8 going now. That's everything looks good. Okay, I think on how far out I get now.
The drop was standard, the flight routine, the landing uneventful. 2 weeks later, another new face appeared. Major Bob White climbed the ladder to the cockpit to try his hand at rocket plane flying. An hour and a half later, the X-15 Pilots Club had another new member. The Air Force's project pilot had made his initial run and now was ready to start some serious research flying. The spring of the year saw a flurry of activity with 2 X-15s flying and North American racking up 9 drops with the number 2 airplane. The Air Force and NASA alternated pilots on a separate series of 9 research expeditions, flights that kept inching up on the world speed and altitude records. Both company and governmental pilots kept investigating the flight abilities of the planes in different quarters, feeling out the new machines, steadily pushing the operating area out farther, gaining confidence. All flying during this period was done with the XLR-11, the small engine package. Its thrust of 16,000 pounds was adequate for early investigations, but everyone was waiting for the big engine. The XLR-99, a brute that would blast out nearly 60,000 pounds of thrust to drive the plane to peak speeds and altitudes. This engine is installed in the third and last plane of the series, which has always been slated to be the test bed for this new power plant. And Crossfield uses his time in between flights to ring out the installation. Preliminaries are out of the way, and this run will be one of the final before flight. This long-awaited engine can be throttled, having an idle output of 30,000 pounds, but able to be regulated between idle and 60,000 pounds of thrust. Today's runs are the climax of a long series of tests proving the installation. After this start, they're ready for flight.
Malfunction. Throttle off. Reset.
In a split second, years of planning, months of test and grinding work went up in smoke. There was only one real observer, one eyewitness, the pilot, Scott Crossfield. Scott, what was your immediate reaction?
Well, it was the biggest bang that I'd ever heard. Fortunately for me and the airplane, the explosion blew the forward section, the tanks, and the cockpit out of the blaze, or out of the major part of the blaze. And the firemen were right on their toes, and they moved in to blanket the tanks and the fire area with foam. The first reaction we had was that the engine had blown up, but like many first impressions, this was wrong. As soon as the parts cooled down, a disenchanted group of engineers moved in, and as you might imagine, things were pretty well scattered about. We also took a close look at the film that you've just seen, and here are a couple of frames that gave us our first clue. Just before the blow-up, a cloud of vapor appeared ahead of the engine. So the search was concentrated on this area. Following up this lead, we found that the hydrogen peroxide tank had been rammed, smashed open. But with what? Lining up with the tank is the center structure of the ammonia tank, and its shape matched the impacted area of the hydrogen peroxide sphere. But how could this part fail? Likely through overpressure. Now, a check of the instrumentation showed tank pressures far over normal. Again, the question, why? The pressure regulator was recovered and checked. It was determined that freezing caused by the very low temperature pressurizing gas had caused the regulator to stick full open. But there's a safety, a valve to relieve overpressure. This valve and the entire release system was also checked. Here it was determined that a flow-sensitive relief valve, combined with a vapor disposal equipment, had created enough back pressure to fail the tank. So, a frozen regulator, a fully relief valve, and a high back pressure relief system had gotten together, and we had wrecked an airplane. The entire pressurizing and release systems were analyzed, redesigned, tested, and retested. We ran the combination time after time, deliberately creating the most severe failures possible. Weeks passed before we and everyone else were convinced that the problem was licked. As a measure of how the confidence was restored, here is what happened on the 4th of August.
On this historic date, Joe Walker let out a yip of joy. He had just pushed the modified small engine airplane to a new speed record, then made his report to the public.
How does it feel to be the fastest living human? I don't know if I feel much different than I did yesterday. They said that the waiting for the flight is over finally.
165. Call it back area, Joe. Roger. Shine Olympic. Go ahead. Over. Go. Burn out. Plus 3 plus. You made it.
At what point did you reach your maximum speed? If you notice the vapor trail from the engine, at the instant it cut off, that was the point at which I reached the maximum speed. Now, what was your altitude then? Around 66,000. How long were you going that 2,150 miles? Just one instant.
Then, on the 12th of August, just 8 days later, Major Bob White was up before the cameras after his 136,500-foot record-breaking altitude flight.
The flight today offered, I would say, no problems, and nothing that could be considered a limitation as far as man's ability to fly an aircraft.
Pull up. Right on the track. Your angle looks good, Bob. You're going up. Pass 9.
Once I pitched up and reached the highest climb angle, I was very definitely impressed that I was going, well, almost straight up. Of course, it wasn't straight up, but it appears to be that way from the cockpit.
Are you coming up on 10 now? Okay. Angle's very good. Going through 11 now. Turn out. Out now at coming 12 now. Got 12.6 and 13. Very sensitive. That's still good. Fantastic up here.
What you see at this altitude impressed me as being the most dramatic point of flying at over 130,000 feet. The very dark blue sky and the lighter band that was immediately surrounding the Earth, and then, of course, the many, many miles off in the distance that you're able to see. Looking to the future, I would say that we hope very much, and I would particularly like to continue on in work that would take us to higher altitudes with manned aircraft.
Now the full potential of the airplane with the small engines had been fully investigated. While the number 2 airplane was being fitted with the big engine, number 1 began a series of training flights. The full crew was now given a chance to try its hand at piloting the research plane. Commander Peterson, the Navy's representative, was the 4th man to ride the X-15. He made 2 flights in early fall. Then Jack McKay, NASA research pilot, took his first ride at the end of October. Captain Rushworth, the Air Force backup pilot, was next to show his skill at rocket plane flying. NASA pilot Neil Armstrong's last 2 flights closed the year. Training flights filled the gap while the number 2 was being given a complete checkout with the large engine. Since that ill-fated day in June when the explosion ripped the number 3 ship in half, maximum effort has been exerted toward getting another engine and installing it in Ship 2. Months of work, weeks of painstaking trials, round-the-clock days of final pre-flight were at last put to the test on the morning of November the 15th. This is the X-15 in its final stage of development. This run, if successful, will mark the beginning of a whole new era of flight research.
That's awesome. Okay, down here, Scott. Okay to go? Right. Roger. 25. Pump vital. The vital cooling got down. Got it. Launch. Turning off to the right, Scotty. The launch tank pressure is going up to 60. And I'm going up here. I'm reading 320. Launch wake is holding at about 55. About 1-2, that big one open. How's the lookout? Up real good, Scotty. You made about a 10-degree turn to the right when you came off.
With the new engine loafing at idle, the plane could go to 4 times the speed of sound. So the speed brakes are open to stay close to Mach 2.
It's good, Scott. A little right, of course. You're okay.
Byron, there you go. Scott, could you tell us in your own words how the flight went and what you thought of it?
Very well, and the engine and its power is impressive.
What was your maximum altitude and speed? Did you have a chance to check that yourself?
Yeah, we got about 80,000 feet and a Mach number approaching 3.
Scott, your radio talk sounded a bit hesitant this morning before takeoff. What was that about?
Oh, no, I think you misinterpreted that. Of course, we've been doing the best we can to get this flight off for 5 years. There's any hesitancy there.
What having observed the minimum thrust performance of the engine, do you think that the airplane now will be able to live up to its design promises of altitude and speed, or will it exceed it, or how do you feel?
Yeah, really, without question, I got a little faster today than we'd planned, and we had on our previous flights, and my flights, gotten faster than we planned, because we're, once in history, we've overestimated the drag on the airplane. I think it'll exceed its original expectations.
Just 7 days later, the second flight was launched. And on the 6th of December, the third. Both showed the engine to have all the abilities claimed of it. These 2 eminently successful flights closed the year. But the story of the X-15 stands not in the past, but in the future, when every flight is a record breaker, when every trip away from the B-52 is an unparalleled research mission. Human hands will be learning a new skill, to thrust deep into unexplored areas, capture vital information, then settle to a safe return from that twilight land standing between Earth and space.
Okay to go? Right. I'm responsive. Roger. Come pilot. Battery cooling got down. Got it. Launch. Turning off to the right, starting. The launch tank pressure is going up to 60. And I'm going uphill. I'm reading 320. Launch tank is holding at about 55. Going uphill all the time. Going out.
This vast, flat glide to the lake bed became a routine sight during 1960. 27 times, roughly once every 2 weeks, the skids creased the desert floor. 27 drops from 41 tries chalked up an unparalleled research plane record. At the beginning of the year, the X-15 was new, almost untried. At the year's end, it was proven, a record holder, discovering more about hypersonic speeds and extreme altitudes. January saw the #1 airplane make its final qualifying flight. Delivery to the Air Force and NASA started a new crew on acceptance check and pre-flight readying. Joe Walker, chief research pilot of the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, was the first to show that the X-15 is not a one-man airplane. At this time, 2 X-15s were flight ready. #1 was involved in the Air Force NASA program to take the airplane with its present engines and push it to the limit of its abilities. And Joe Walker's first flight denotes the start of this research phase. The #2 plane was still being flown by North American for investigation of stability, control, flying qualities.
2, 1, 3. Okay, that's nice, Joe. Turn a little to the right now. I would say that's okay. Okay, we got all 8 going now. Roger, everything looks, good. Okay, I'll need to check in on how far out I get now. Okay.
The drop was standard, the flight routine, the landing uneventful. 2 weeks later, another new face appeared. Major Bob White climbed the ladder to the cockpit to try his hand at rocket plane flying. An hour and a half later, the X-15 Pilots Club had another new member. The Air Force's project pilot had made his initial run and now was ready to start some serious research flying. The spring of the year saw a flurry of activity with 2 X-15s flying and North American ranking up 9 drops with the #2 airplane. The Air Force and NASA alternated pilots on a separate series of 9 research expeditions, flights that kept inching up on the world speed and altitude records. Both company and governmental pilots kept investigating the flight abilities of the planes in different quarters, feeling out the new machines, steadily pushing the operating area out farther, gaining confidence. All flying during this period was done with the XLR-11, the small engine package. Its thrust of 16,000 pounds was adequate for early investigations, but everyone was waiting for the big engine. The XLR-99, a brute that would blast out nearly 60,000 pounds of thrust to drive the plane to peak speeds and altitudes. This engine is installed in the third and last plane of the series, which has always been slated to be the test bed for this new power plant. And Crossfield uses his time in between flights to ring out the installation. Preliminaries are out of the way, and this run will be one of the final before flight. This long-awaited engine can be throttled, having an idle output of 30,000 pounds, but able to be regulated between idle and 60,000 pounds of thrust. Today's runs are the climax of a long series of tests proving the installation. After this start, they're ready for flight. In a split second, years of planning, months of test and grinding work went up in smoke. There was only one real observer, one eyewitness, the pilot, Scott Crossfield. Scott, what was your immediate reaction?
Well, it was the biggest bang that I'd ever heard. Fortunately for me and the airplane, the explosion blew the forward section, the tanks, and the cockpit out of the blaze, or out of the major part of the blaze. And the firemen were right on their toes, and they moved in to blanket the tanks and the fire area with foam. The first reaction we had was that the engine had blown up, but like many first impressions, this was wrong. As soon as the parts cooled down, a disenchanted group of engineers moved in, and as you might imagine, things were pretty well scattered about. We also took a close look at the film that you've just seen, and here are a couple of frames that gave us our first clue. Just before the blow-up, a cloud of vapor appeared ahead of the engine. So the search was concentrated on this area. Following up this lead, we found that the hydrogen peroxide tank had been rammed, smashed open. But with what? Lining up with the tank is the center structure of the ammonia tank, and its shape matched the impacted area of the hydrogen peroxide sphere. But how could this part fail? Likely through overpressure. Now, a check of the instrumentation showed tank pressures far over normal. Again, the question, why? The pressure regulator was recovered and checked. It was determined that freezing caused by the very low temperature pressurizing gas had caused the regulator to stick full open. But there's a safety, a valve to relieve overpressure. This valve and the entire relief system was also checked. Here it was determined that a flow-sensitive relief valve combined with a vapor disposal equipment had created enough back pressure to fail the tank. So, a frozen regulator, a Foley relief valve, and a high back pressure relief system had gotten together, and we had wrecked an airplane. The entire pressurizing and release systems were analyzed, redesigned, tested, and retested. We ran the combination time after time, deliberately creating the most severe failures possible. Weeks passed before we and everyone else were convinced that the problem was licked. As a measure of how the confidence was restored, here is what happened on the 4th of August.
On this historic date, Joe Walker let out a yip of joy. Yippee! He had just pushed the modified small-engine airplane to a new speed record, then made his report to the public.
Joe, how does it feel to be the fastest living human?
I don't know if I feel much different than I did yesterday, except that the waiting for the flight is over finally.
60 at 165.
Quarterback area, Joe.
Roger.
Gyro look good.
Your boy. Push over.
Go.
Burn out. Plus
At what point did you reach your maximum speed?
If you notice the vapor trail from the engine, at the instant it cut off, that was the point at which I reached the maximum speed,
Now, what was your altitude then?
around 66,000.
How long were you going that 2,150 miles?
Just one instant.
Then, on the 12th of August, just 8 days later, Major Bob White was up before the cameras after his 136,500-foot record-breaking altitude flight.
The flight today offered, I would say, no problems, nothing that could be considered a limitation as far as man's ability to fly an aircraft.
Pull up. Roger. Right on the track. Your angle looks good, Bob. Sure going up. Pass 9.
Once I pitched up and reached the highest climb angle, I was very definitely impressed that I was going, well, almost straight up. Of course, it wasn't straight up, but it appears to be that way from the cockpit.
Got you coming up on 10 now. Okay. Angle's very good. Going through 11 now. Burn out. Burn out now. At coming 12 now. Got 12.6 and 13. Very sensitive. That's still good. Fantastic up here.
What you see at this altitude impressed me as being the most dramatic point of flying at over 130,000 feet. The very dark blue sky and the lighter band that was immediately surrounding the Earth, and then, of course, the many, many miles off in the distance that you're able to see. Looking to the future, I would say that we hope very much, and I would particularly like to continue on in work that would take us to higher altitudes with manned aircraft.
Now the full potential of the airplane with the small engines had been fully investigated. While the number 2 airplane was being fitted with the big engine, number 1 began a series of training flights. The full crew was now given a chance to try its hand at piloting the research plane. Commander Peterson, the Navy's representative, was the 4th man to ride the X-15. He made 2 flights in early fall. Then Jack McKay, NASA research pilot, took his first ride at the end of October. Captain Rushworth, the Air Force backup pilot, was next to show his skill at rocket plane flying. NASA pilot Neil Armstrong's last 2 flights closed the year. Training flights filled the gap while the number 2 was being given a complete checkout with the large engine. Since that ill-fated day in June when the explosion ripped the number 3 ship in half, maximum effort has been exerted toward getting another engine and installing it in Ship 2. Months of work, weeks of painstaking trials, round-the-clock days of final pre-flight were at last put to the test on the morning of November the 15th. This is the X-15 in its final stage of development. This run, if successful, will mark the beginning of a whole new era of flight research.
Camera. Looks okay down here, Scott. Okay to go? Right. Roger. 25. Don't pilot.
Idle cooling went down.
Got it. Launch. Turning off to the right, Scotty. The launch tank pressure is going up to 60. And I'm going uphill. I'm reading 320. Launch tank is holding at about 55. About 1-2, dive brake showing open. How's it look, Al? Looked real good, Scotty. You made about a 10-degree turn to the right when you came off.
With the new engine loafing at idle, the plane could go to 4 times the speed of sound. So the speed brakes are open to stay close to Mach 2.
It's good, Scott. A little to the right, of course. You're okay.
Fire when ready, Ralph.
Scott, could you tell us in your own words how the flight went and what you thought of it?
Very well, and the engine and its power is impressive.
What was your maximum altitude and speed? Did you have a chance to check that yourself?
Yeah, I got about 80,000 feet and a Mach number approaching 3.
Scott, your radio talk sounded a bit hesitant this morning before takeoff. What was that about?
Oh, no, I think you misinterpreted that. Of course, we've been doing the best we can to get this flight off for 5 years. I don't think there's any hesitancy there.
Scott, having observed the minimum thrust performance of the engine, do you think that the airplane now will be able to live up to its design promises of altitude and speed, or will exceed it, or what do you feel?
Yeah, really, without question. I got a little faster today than we'd planned, and we have in our previous flights, in my flights, gotten faster than we'd planned, because for once in history, we've overestimated the drag on the airplane. I think it'll exceed its original expectations.
Just 7 days later, the second flight was launched, and on the 6th of December, the third. Both showed the engine to have all the abilities claimed of it. These two eminently successful flights closed the year. But the story of the X-15 stands not in the past, but in the future, when every flight is a record breaker. Trip away from the B-52 is an unparalleled research mission. Human hands will be learning a new skill to thrust deep into unexplored areas, capture vital information, then settle to a safe return from that twilight land standing between Earth and space.
It was a strange business. Actually, the way it was run at the old NACA there would be a delight to run something like that today. People trusted one another. The engineers, and I'm an engineer, and I and the head of the station were talking about tomorrow's flight, and I was uncomfortable about something. He always said, you heard the pilot, and he gave me 24 hours to decide what to do about it, or to go do it anyway, or not do it. But he always gave me that latitude, so it gave us an opportunity to think out what we were doing, and you never were pressured, even though probably I was the most pressured at that. I hated just sitting around waiting for, it was not a fast-moving business. Research never is, you know. And I was 3 years in the design group on the X-15. I think I contributed to it. And then I took it into flight test and did the demonstration flights on it. But we had demonstrated at that time, I owned all the quality control, reliability engineering, and systems test on Apollo. And we were doing an incredible job. In 3 years, we went from 3,500 to 35,000, and we're testing hardware that was going to go to the moon. And those were long, hard days. It's a challenge. It's a lot of fun. It could be dangerous if you weren't up on the edge of your seat paying attention to business. And that's about all I can describe of it. We really wrote the book for almost everything we've done in aeronautics with the research airplanes in those days. And we never really had much in the way of information in the transonic area. Nobody did.
Okay, your position looks good, Joe. Let's go Delta Scion.
Haven't gotten to 1 minute warning yet. One minute. LSI. Push the test. Rock side showing. Prime. Igniter ready light. Pre-cool on. Igniter rising. 20 seconds to launch. Everything checks here.
Your position is good, Joe.
Pump idle. Good pump. Good igniter. Ready to launch now. Good light. Okay.
This is the X-15 research aircraft, designed to investigate the problems of manned flight in a near-space environment. Altitudes up to 50 miles, speeds up to Mach 6. High-speed aerodynamics, aerodynamic heating, structural design, aircraft stability, and control in space and re-entry. This was the kind of information it was to provide, and provided it did. Here's the story. Before the X-15, the question had been, what is to be man's role in space travel? Can he pilot an aircraft out of the Earth's atmosphere, fly it in space, then re-enter the atmosphere and bring it back to a safe landing on Earth? There were many unknowns to be discovered, many problems to be overcome before the answer would be known. That today's test flight is almost routine is a tribute to the comprehensive program that has moved step by step to prove that man can pilot an aircraft into space and return.
Give us a 20,000 foot check, Joe.
Coming up on 20,000 now.
Okay, I know you've done it, but check your flaps and circuit breakers.
Roger. Done.
Ready to go pressurized?
Pressurized.
You're in good shape.
Flaps. And flaps are coming down. Here. Can't seem to get her on the ground. Real nice. Well, sir, now we're done with the second cross-country. Yeah, boy.
Real good flight, Joe. This is your happy controller going off the air.
There have been many men who have helped make the X-15 project a success. One of them is aircraft research engineer Hartley Soule, who was originally in charge of designing and building the X-15 aircraft.
Of course, I'm retired now, and the X-15, she's not the queen of the hangar anymore, although she's still hard at work. But I remember years ago, you know, it was long before Sputnik that we decided to build the X-15. This airplane, the first hypersonic aircraft, was going to be our first manned space probe. This was a logical step in the research aircraft program that had begun even before the end of World War II.
From the beginning, the research aircraft program was a cooperative affair. The National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, predecessor to NASA, the aircraft industry, the Air Force, the Navy, working together. Their first effort was directed at breaking the sound barrier. And the aircraft that would do it was the X-1, designed to acquire flight data at the speed of sound. On October 14th, 1947, with Air Force Captain Charles E. Yeager at the controls, the X-1 made the world's first supersonic flight. Other research aircraft soon followed the X-1. The Douglas D-558 Phase 1, to investigate flight with a straight wing at high subsonic speeds. The Northrop X-4, designed to fly without a tail. The Douglas D-558 Phase 2, to study flight characteristics of swept-wing aircraft at transonic and supersonic speeds. The Bell X-5, designed with variable sweep. And the Douglas X-3, to investigate thin, straight wings at speeds beyond Mach 1. The Bell X-1A, with its increased performance, first of a series of follow-on aircraft to the original X-1. The X-2, another Bell airplane designed to explore aircraft behavior at altitudes above 100,000 feet and Mach 3 speeds. The X-1E and X-1B, both later follow-ons to the X-1. Step by step, these different aircraft helped nibble away at the unknown, until by 1956, the frontiers of manned flight had been advanced from speeds of 500 miles an hour to Mach 3, and from altitudes of only 40,000 to more than 100,000 feet.
Speed, altitude, sure we kept going higher and faster than we'd ever been before. Only because that's where new information, where the unknown has always been found in flight, above and beyond the limits you've already reached.
As early as 1952, the X-15 aircraft was being conceived by the people at NACA. At the Langley Center in Virginia, they began investigating the unknowns associated with flight to the thinnest edges of the Earth's atmosphere. One unknown concerned aerodynamic heating. The X-15 would be the first aircraft to push from supersonic to hypersonic speeds, where the flow of air would heat the leading edges of the plane to 1,300 degrees Fahrenheit. Experiment after experiment was run to see if this extreme temperature would weaken or melt basic materials. The data resulting from tests run well beyond temperatures expected for the X-15 proved that there were materials that would withstand this kind of heat. Another problem, after rocket engines shut down, the X-15 would be thrust into a ballistic arc in air so thin that normal aerodynamic control would be impossible. How then could the pilot control the aircraft? The answer? Reaction controls that would allow him to correct roll movement and position the aircraft properly for re-entry through the atmosphere. But the designers knew the problems of control would never be fully solved until an X-15 aircraft was actually built.
We knew the X-15 would look something like this. We knew that it would be a manned aircraft that would fly more than 4,000 miles an hour and as high as 250,000 feet. We knew that, like the X-1, the X-15 would be air-launched and propelled on its flight by a rocket motor, the most powerful engine ever installed in an airplane. Of course, we didn't know what kind of a rocket motor that would prove to be.
There'd never been anything like it. Designed for a manned system, the 50,000 pounds of thrust in its single chamber had to be controllable at the pilot's discretion. He had to be able to throttle this engine in flight.
This is Harry Cook, program manager for the X-15 rocket engine.
The LR-99 rocket engine was designed and built for the X-15 by the Reaction Motors Division of the Thiokol Chemical Corporation. We had had some experience in this field. Reaction Motors had built power plants for all of the X-1s and for the D-558 Phase 2 aircraft. But those rocket engines we had made for earlier research planes were primitive forerunners of the engine we built for the X-15.
57,000 pounds of thrust with a throttle attached. No engine like this had ever existed before, but Thiokol built one for the X-15. Now, what kind of airframe could be designed to carry such an engine?
The X-15 was designed and built to take the stresses encountered at hypersonic speeds, to go to extreme high altitude and to beat the heat, survive the extreme high temperatures that build up on the wing, fuselage, and tail during the re-entry to the Earth's atmosphere. The engineering research contribution we made at North American Aviation to the X-15 project was to take NASA's proposal to build this aircraft and to find out how they could be met.
Harrison Storms. He was in charge of the X-15 program at North American Aviation.
For example, they proposed to use a new nickel alloy metal for the protective sheath or skin on all three of the airframes of the X-15. We had to find out how it could be used.
Inconel X was the name of the new nickel alloy. It was developed to withstand the searing temperatures at hypersonic speeds, temperatures of 1,200 degrees Fahrenheit or more. But to use Inconel X, it had to be cross-welded, and no one had been able to do it before. A major milestone was passed when North American discovered how it could be done. North American also originated the idea of fairings along each side of the X-15 fuselage to house control cables and hydraulic lines. This left the entire fuselage volume for power plant plumbing, as well as fuel and propellant tanks. Another invaluable North American contribution was the X-15 flight simulator, permitting pilots and ground controllers to plan and practice flights without ever leaving the ground. From an exact replica of the X-15 cockpit, the pilot could actuate hydraulic and control systems identical to those on the aircraft itself. All this was tied into an analog computer that could program actual X-15 missions and simulate every conceivable in-flight problem the pilot might expect to face. Practice in the flight simulator was just one phase of pre-flight preparation. Another took place in the centrifuge at the Navy's Air Development Test Center at Johnsville, Pennsylvania. There, pilots learned how to take the heavy G forces they would meet when they flew the X-15 up into space and back down again. Hours of training here, added to hours in the simulator, extended the pre-flight pilot training period into weeks and even months. Then came the dramatic moment. The X-15 and its B-52 launch aircraft were ready. North American test pilot Scott Crossfield was ready. Step by step, the X-15 research project had moved to this important event. Now, the first of 3 X-15s was about to begin a series of test flights. The schedule called for an orderly progression of tests. In the first flights, the X-15 would remain attached to the B-52. Then a glide flight would be tried. Only then would powered flight be attempted. This careful program of flight tests, flown by pilot Scott Crossfield, proved the X-15 would do just what its designers hoped she would.
From March 10th, 1959 until late in 1960, when we delivered the 3rd aircraft to the Air Force, I made 14 captive flights, 1 glide flight, and 10 powered flights. It was all pretty much routine. We, North American that is, went up there to check out the aircraft, to check out the systems, to see how she handled and whether or not she'd meet the specs before we turned her over to the Air Force. But you'll have to go up to NASA's Flight Research Center at Edwards to find out how the actual test programs worked.
Edwards Air Force Base in the Mojave Desert in California. This is where the X-15 story comes together. For here is where test flights of all high-speed research aircraft since the X-1 have taken place. Like all the programs conducted here, the X-15 Flight Research Project had a simple basis. A series of progressive steps to higher speeds and to higher altitudes. But each step, each flight itself, had a more immediate purpose than simply to gain more speed or altitude. And each flight was carefully planned to make the most effective use of this aircraft as a research vehicle or a tool. Paul Bickle, director of NASA's Flight Research Center.
Each flight provided new information or confirmed wind tunnel or theoretical data on the characteristics of an airplane performing in a very advanced flight regime. Each flight grew out of one that had already taken place and led to another still to come. Of course, the X-15 flight program really began in the simulator months before the first airplane was delivered to us.
Joe Walker, Chief NASA Edwards research pilot, physicist, and pilot of a long list of research aircraft.
Practice or planning in the simulator is the beginning of every flight that's ever been made in the X-15. All pilots assigned to the project first become familiar with the handling characteristics and timing of the X-15 on any given mission in the flight simulator. It's been good insurance for all of us.
One of the X-15 pilots who has spent many hours in the flight simulator is NASA's Milton Thompson. Here, Thompson flies a practice mission under normal procedure, with pilot engineer John McKay working as his flight planner. In a nearby room where the analog computer is housed, the activity in the cockpit can be monitored on closed-circuit TV. The pilot's control movements and the airplane's simulated response are checked on a plotter by the flight planner, who will monitor the actual flight from the NASA Edwards Control Center on the ground. The pilot's inputs may also be monitored and recorded by other instruments. Variations from the planned mission are then simulated, so the pilot will learn to recognize their effects on the aircraft. For example, he may get a problem involving changes in stability. These changes are fed by the computer to his cockpit instruments. The pilot reads the changes and makes control inputs to bring the aircraft back to normal. His response is monitored and evaluated. The pilot also goes through what is called trouble school, where failure of one or more of the X-15's major systems is simulated. Again, his reaction is monitored. Each pilot gets further practice by making a number of flights in a modified F-104 aircraft. He flies over his upcoming X-15 flight course to establish geographic checkpoints and key altitudes in the landing pattern. All flights are made over the high range, a network of ground tracking stations stretching from Wendover, Utah, 485 miles south to Edwards in California. The range consists of a master station at Edwards and radar stations at Ely, Nevada, and at Beatty. The flight corridor is 50 miles wide, and it contains a number of dry lake beds where emergency landings can be made. Two kinds of powered flights are made over the high range. One, a ballistic type, high-altitude run up to and even above 250,000 feet. And two, a high-speed run made at a lower altitude, usually 60 to 70,000 feet. During his practice flights in the F-104, the pilot must also familiarize himself with the timing and positioning for an X-15 landing at both primary and alternate landing sites. And he makes practice landings, using predetermined settings that can simulate the low lift-drag ratio of the X-15. Nothing is left to chance, in the air or on the ground.
These precautions paid off during the following flight, when the pilot realized he could only get 30% power, and that consequently he would have to make an emergency landing at Mud Lake.
Ready for launch. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Relatively light, relatively light.
Top.
Go in front, get the chamber reading.
Got 12 degrees.
Okay.
Chamber pressure. Push the throttle up and give us chamber pressure.
Oh, yeah, I have chamber pressure about 200.
Roger, you got the full throttle?
I'm full.
You're running at 30%.
30%? How are we doing, Bobby?
Roger, you're going by Mud Lake. It looks like a landing at Mud Lake.
Roger. Looks on the slope down there like there's a very tiny bit of run from perhaps south and a little bit east, so it's not...
Wrecked though it seemed to be, both the aircraft and the pilot survived to continue with the program. This was one of only 3 major accidents, all non-fatal, that have occurred in more than 120 flights with the X-15, a remarkable record of reliability. In February 1964, the plane that crashed on Mud Lake only a few months before came rolling out of the North American plant with a new designation, the X-15A2. This modified version was rebuilt for flight to Mach 8 times the speed of sound, where the airflow temperature rises to 2,400 degrees Fahrenheit. The new X-15 had a new heat-resistant protective coating, a new inertial guidance system, a longer fuselage, external tanks to carry more fuel for longer flights, and lengthened landing gear. All the while this new X-15 was being built, tests were continuing with the other two aircraft, and they continue today. For every flight, the procedure is essentially the same. Every phase carefully planned, every second of actual flight time mapped out in advance. That way, every man involved knows exactly what his job will be from the beginning to the end of the flight. Hours of preparation, weeks of planning, months of study, whole years of research. All this goes with the X-15 each time she leaves the hangar for another flight. For after all, no matter how many flights have been made before, each new test will probe a little deeper into the unknown. She is a research tool, this sleek black aircraft, carrying a host of instruments, gauges, and recorders to explore the unknown. And every second of her time in flight must be carefully charted. That's why at the Ely High Range Station, at Beatty, at Edwards, sensitive antenna watch and listen to each flight. That's why the pilot's heartbeat never really leaves the ground. And that's why in each control room on the ground, the plotting board is carefully watched for any unplanned deviation, for any unlooked-for change in the pilot's reactions or in the behavior of the aircraft. Position and velocity computers, telemetry receivers and monitors, data receiving and recording equipment, communications receivers and transmitters, they all go into action at the beginning of every flight. In NASA 1, the project men stand by, alert for any possible trouble in the flight, while flight surgeons prepare to watch the pilot's physiological response, his pulse, his body temperature, heart action, respiration rate. All of this will be telemetered to the ground. Then, as always, when time for takeoff draws near, attention focuses on the man chosen to fly the mission. Because of this, the X-15 pilot becomes, in effect, the symbol for the entire research team. The one man who represents all the others who have worked so long and so hard to make the project a success. And it is a proud record of accomplishment they've achieved. They have designed and built an aircraft that could be piloted into space and flown back safely to a controlled landing on Earth. They have accumulated important data on aerodynamic heating at hypersonic speeds. They've learned about stability and control of aircraft during flight in near space and re-entry to the Earth's atmosphere. And perhaps most important of all, they have dramatized the potential of piloted high-performance aircraft in a space environment at a time when much of the world's gaze was turned toward orbital flight. The X-15 research project has long since achieved its original goals. The aircraft has been flown successfully more than 120 times, and although setting new records wasn't its purpose, it has set a few along the way. Altitude, 67 miles. Speed, Mach 6, 4,104 miles an hour, the highest and fastest a winged aircraft has ever flown. Today, the X-15 moves on to further accomplishment. But now the Thoroughbred has become a workhorse, carrying a heavy payload of instruments, undertaking studies of the near-space environment possible before only with unmanned satellite and rocket-borne probes. There are many people who should share the credit for the continuing success of the X-15 research project. But perhaps they will understand if we seem to focus on those who have actually flown the many research aircraft since the X-1. By saluting these courageous men, we also pay homage to all the others who have helped us move step by step, deeper and deeper, into the unknown outskirts of space.
Sir, if I can ask you the tough question first, if you could give us your name and the spelling of your name.
My name is Albert Scott Crossfield, Jr. ALBERTSCOTTCROSSFIELD JR.
With the period at the end.
Yeah.
Where were you born, sir?
I was born in Berkeley, California.
What was life like in Berkeley in those days?
I don't know. We left Berkeley when I was less than a year old. My father was a professor at the University of California, a petroleum chemist that worked for the Union Oil Company there at Oleum. In fact, he helped build that refinery there.
Where did you move to?
We moved from there to Long Beach and then to Wilmington, California, which is the harbor of Los Angeles. And my father was material in building that big Union Oil refinery there on the hill in San Pedro, and he was superintendent of that refinery.
What was your childhood like?
What was it like? Well, I was a kid. No, I was raised mostly in Wilmington till I was about 14 years old. I was not well as a youngster. Had rheumatic fever very badly, which should have precluded all of my flight career, but I never let anybody know it. And 1935, when I was 14, we moved to the state of Washington. The Depression days, my father was in the oil business, and that wasn't doing well, and he wanted to get back to the land and get away from the business world, which wasn't doing very well in the early 30s. So we moved up to a farm in the state of Washington, and he and I built that farm over the next few years and got it back on a profitable basis. Probably was a godsend for me in my physical condition because I didn't have time, wasn't allowed to be sick. That was my father's nature. And I got to be a pretty strong farm kid and managed to get along pretty well after that physically.
You had your first ride in a plane when you were 6?
Yeah, I rode in an Alexander Eagle Rock with a guy named Carl Lenish, who was a chemist for the Union Oil Company and had been a World War I military pilot. And as collateral duties with the company, he used to fly the company airplanes. Union Oil Company, I think, probably started the first business aviation fleet. And my father was a good friend of his. And he flew me, I believe, the first flight I ever had, he flew me from Monrovia Airport to Burbank, where we saw Pancho Barnes. And I've known her ever since, or known of her mostly. Of course, I was just a little kid. She didn't have much to do with little kids in those days. And she was typically Pancho Barnes, a heart as big as the world, goggles shoved back on her helmet, on her head, smoking black Mexican cigarillos, and murdering the Queen's English with 4-letter words in every sentence, and quite a gal.
So was that where the love of aviation came from, that first flight?
I think it was my generation. What was exciting, all through the 20s and 30s were airplanes. And we all built model airplanes from the time we could hold a stick. Free flight models. Learned an awful lot from the model airplane news and all of us getting together and competing. And It may have helped. Undoubtedly it helped. But I went to sleep on that first flight up in the front cockpit. They tell me. I don't really remember if I did or not. But no, my generation was aviation oriented, much as this generation's computer oriented.
So when you were 12, you started taking flying lessons at 12?
At Wilmington Airport in California, it was right at where now the Figueroa Freeway goes through Wilmington, was an old slough, and a guy named Von McNulty was starving to death on that airport. And he needed a newspaper, so I delivered him a newspaper all month long, the Long Beach Press-Telegram. And helped him clean up his airplanes from the mud on that slough. And my reward was about a half hour, an hour flight instruction every month. That's where I started.
What did it feel like to be flying a plane at the age of 12?
At 12 or any time you're flying, you don't take time for psychological analysis. I enjoyed it. I thought it was the way to go. That's about all I could say.
And where were you when you heard that Pearl Harbor had been bombed?
I was working for Boeing that Sunday morning. We were working overtime. I worked on the A-20 line at Boeing in Seattle. And the news came over. There weren't too many people in the plant on Sunday. And I heard that, and of course we didn't do much work that day. We listened to the radio and speculated. And I frankly thought this is going to be a biggie. And I have to get in it. And probably won't live through it. Generally, that had to be the attitude. You see, we're taking on two of the biggest navies and armies in the world. But I went to the University of Washington in 1940, and in 41, I quit that fall to go to Boeing to make enough money to go to school. I'd run out of money.
You thought that there was a good possibility that you would die in the war?
Well, that's a probability of anybody in a war. And I was determined I was going to fly in the war. I knew damn good and well I had a bigger job getting into the Air Corps and the Navy than I had flying. And I managed to work that through many devious channels. And, they went into the Air Force right after Pearl Harbor. They sent me down to Willie Field, Arizona, and it was just a sea of young people. And we just got off the train, and they gave us a ticket home and said, "Don't call us, we'll call you." You know, they couldn't feed them. They had no clothes for them. And everybody joined. So I went back and got my job back at Boeing for a while and decided if this war is going to be over for, I can go win it. And so I switched over and went over to the Navy, and they were glad to snatch up a potential Army recruit. So I was in the Navy for the 4 years of World War II.
What did you do during the war, sir?
I was an instructor and fighter and gunnery instructor at Corpus Christi, Texas, most of the war up for 32 months. And in 1944, I finally got orders to the fleet. And ended up after a few moves with Air Group 51, and we were staging for the invasion when the war was over.
Where were you when you heard about that the bomb had been dropped?
Pearl Harbor. The day the bomb had dropped, we were flying a lot of patrols over Pearl Harbor because the Navy was real goosey about what the Japanese might do. And I'll never forget that day because as far as I could see were ships. Ships of the line, battleships, cruisers, destroyers, carriers, 200 carriers, I'd guess, loaded to the gunnels with airplanes, troop ships low in the water, supply ships. And they're sitting up at 30,000 feet just putting in the time in case there was some kind of a raid on us. And I can remember just thinking, in less than a month, all of that's going to be on the bottom because it was going to be a tough fight to get into Japan. They had 5 air groups assigned to my ship for the first week, not 5 pilots, 5 air groups, if she were still afloat. We were going to support the 2nd Marines going in right below Tokyo, and they were at double strength and had another double strength division right behind them, figuring they'd be pretty well wiped out the first day. And we knew that there was no way we were going to get back from that one. And our ship was pulling out the next day, actually, so I don't know how soon the invasion would have been. Got back to Pearl, and that when I got back, something had happened. And we didn't know what. We didn't know if it was good or bad, but something had happened. The atmosphere just told you that. And then that night, actually, we went back to Maui. We flew back to Maui that night. And that night, the word came out they dropped this bomb, and that it'd probably signal the end of the war. Some celebration on that island. These people that have ventured, the Japanese were about to give up. They're absolutely wrong. They're trying to rewrite history, which is kind of what we were fighting. This was a religious war by then. It was an ethnic and religious war. They had 10,000 kamikazes waiting for us, and everything in the world to throw at us going in there. It would have been one heck of a landing to make that one, because we didn't have Britain 30 miles behind us with San Diego 3,000 miles away, and that was going to be a very interesting. I think we would have won it, but it would have been a terrible price. Thank God for that bomb. Thank God for Tibbets.
When you heard that the bomb had been dropped, did everyone realize the war was over at that point, or did they?
No, but it was a big plus. And then when the second bomb was dropped, it pretty well concluded that the war was coming to an end fast. They couldn't take a beating like that, particularly after we saw the results. The word got out pretty fast, and the pictures. And we had been pretty close to the intelligence on the war for quite a while, and the air groups that were going in. And everything was 180 degrees reversed. Going in, it was going to be a tough thing. And we were working, incidentally, for about almost 8 weeks for the 2nd Marines, using live ammunition, supporting them on several times a week. They'd make a landing on Maui, and we would work out how we were going to go into Japan. And it didn't look like it was doable, but we would have done it. So it was just really the mass of people we would have thrown at. So we knew the war was over. We were pretty sure it was coming to a close pretty fast that night. It was quite a celebration.
What was going on? The celebration. What type of celebration?
Well, everybody got drunk and disorderly. How do military men celebrate?
After World War II, you went back to school?
I went back to University of Washington, started work at University of Washington, Windtown, stayed there until 49. I took most of my engineering over because I'd forgotten so much of it. And then Ensign Charlie Wilson was Secretary of Defense at that time, I guess was Secretary of War, huh? I've forgotten when they changed that. Defense. And he wasn't hiring anybody, and I could make more money working for the university, so I stayed and got our master's degree in aeronautical engineering, and then in 1950. In the meantime, I'd worked with the Navy to build the reserves up. Originally, they didn't have any money for a couple of years for pay, but we knew that we had to hold the capability together. I had a lot of fun then, too. I had the 13th Naval District Aerobatics team and Corsairs. That was a lot of fun.
At what point did you get to Edwards?
When I graduated, I went to Edwards in June of 1950. There wasn't much money in being an engineer in those days, and so it occurred to me that if I went back to flying, I could add something to it. I hadn't really planned on doing that. It was one of the options, but that, wasn't my main one. And I went to hitched a ride with the Navy down to to Moffett Field, and I'd heard they had an opening down there, but I decided not to ask them if I could come down because they'd say, "Oh, I'll come down in a couple of weeks or make an appointment and be too late." So I just went down and walked in their office. Surprisingly enough, they were expecting me. And my wife, who had never opened mail in her life of mine before that or since then, saw a letter that came from NACA and thought maybe that was important. So she opened it, and there was a request to negotiate for an interview with Edwards people at what was then the high-speed flight station. So being at Moffett Field, I got myself down to Edwards and beat everybody else there that letter had gotten to. And I got hired by Walt Williams as an aeronautical research pilot from the NACA.
Did you know much about the program before that?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, we've been following the X-1. In fact, I volunteered to fly the X-1 for nothing when Slick Goodland was trying to get all that big money. I thought that might be a pretty good step in the profession.
You were actually the first one to fly the X-1, weren't you?
No.
No.
Slick Goodland first flew the X-1, and then a number of Air Force pilots, including Chuck Yeager. He doesn't like Charlie. I call him Charlie because Pete Everest introduced me to him as Charlie one time, and I thought all his friends call him Charlie, so I started doing that. Got to be a habit, but I think I'm probably not good enough friend of his to call him Charlie. No, he was the first to fly Mach 1 in the X-1. And that would have been in 1948. That's before I got there.
It says in one of your introductions that you are the only pilot who has ever worn out a pressure suit. Is that true?
I don't know. It could be. I wore a lot of pressure suits and helped develop our first full pressure suit, but that could be. I wore it a lot of times.
You logged a lot of miles, didn't you? A lot of hours.
Not a lot of hours. I've got, I think, somewhere around 130, 140 rocket flights and only about 40 hours. They're not too long flights.
To somebody, most of us who will never be able to do that, describe what that's like.
It's a challenge. It's a lot of fun. It could be dangerous if you weren't up on the edge of your seat paying attention to business. And that's about all I can describe of it. We really wrote the book for almost everything we've done in aeronautics with the research airplanes in those days. And we never really had much in the way of information in the transonic area. Nobody did. And we gathered it all with those airplanes, with a variety of configurations and power plants and that sort of thing to see which way to go. And we used small rocket engines in those days. In fact, we did almost all the successful rocket work in spite of all of the publicity that the Germans brought the rockets over here. When they got over here, they all we know is what Goddard taught us. And before that crowd at Huntsville ever made one that worked, I had 50 rocket flights and several rocket airplanes at that time. And so we pioneered the rocket business. They're small, but it's a matter of caliber, not system. They were identical systems. And the X-1, of course, was first to Mach 1. The X-2 was built to go to Mach 5. The X-3 was to look at thin wing configurations. The X-4 was a tailless airplane. The X-5 was a variable sweep airplane. Just looking at everything we could imagine. The XF-92 was a Delta. I flew all of those airplanes except the X-2 and the X-3. The D-558-1 and 2 were Navy-funded airplanes in the same program. They just didn't put an X on them. They just left the manufacturer's number on them. And actually, the D-558-1 was a jet-powered X-1 that would be able to sustain periods of time at high speeds. Not as high as the X-1, though. I don't believe it ever went supersonic. I think Gene May claimed it did, but I don't know if it really did or not. the D5582 wrote the book for all of our swept wing airplanes today. Really, it was the real workhorse to gain all of the information we needed for transonic swept wings. And almost everything on our airliners and our fighters today came out of that basic work.
Describe the atmosphere at that time at Edwards, what the people were like, what it was like, whether you guys knew you were making history.
It was so different from today, it's awful hard to describe it. It's like a small town, you knew everybody. We put more faith in our professional judgment than we did in computers and endorsements and agreements and all of that. And never once thought of insurance or risk. Well, we thought of risk, but we calculated that. We didn't calculate it, we thought it out pretty much, and it proved to be a good way to do it. And it was very disciplined in the way we did it, but not technically disciplined because we didn't know. And very often every flight for weeks would be into an area that we hadn't gone into. And all of it was on the envelopes of these airplanes that had unknown characteristics, but we solved a lot of problems. The problems with tailless swept-wing airplanes that killed Jeffrey de Havilland and made such a problem for the Navy. I've forgotten what's the one that Chance Vaught made, their tailless airplane. We found out why those airplanes, we didn't solve the problem, we found out why those airplanes were so given so many problems. Well, with the supersonic airplanes, they were all rockets then. We there at NACA, or I did, with Bill Bridgman from Douglas, figured out how to fly in the region's so-called supersonic yaw that was supposed to be lethal, that did in Yeager and Murray and Mel App. And we learned to handle that. Those things taught us how to get there next time around, like with the X-15, the X-2. But mainly it was to find out those characteristics an airplane had to have so it could be controlled by a man and, as part of the system. And handling qualities were the main things we were looking for. Pitch up was a characteristic of swept wings. It was very, it gets your attention. The airplane would pitch up low altitude where the air was dense and pitch up to destruction. At higher altitudes where we did it, it would pitch up to stall. We found ways to relieve or inhibit that. And that's what that was all. It was all experimental. And really one good experiment is worth all the calculations in the world, because we're not smart enough to outguess Mother Nature without going out and try it.
Was it a very competitive place? Were you all competitive with one another?
Yes. I'm not supposed to say, oh, no, we were all a team. That's a bunch of baloney. Fighter ops were down the runway from us. This was originally when I went there, a little 5,000-foot strip and some Butler and World War II buildings. And we got more done there in that atmosphere than we did when the place got real formal with a lot of permanent buildings. But they're all fighter pilots, and they're born competitive, and if they weren't, they sure were taught to be during the war. And so people say, how were you chosen to be a rocket pilot? I wasn't chosen, I chose myself. That's what I was going to do, and I won my spurs. So did other guys, a lot more. I mean, I wasn't alone in doing that. It was a strange business. Actually, the way it was run at the old NACA there would be a delight to run something like that today. People trusted one another. The engineers, and I'm an engineer, and I and the head of the station were talking about tomorrow's flight, and I was uncomfortable about something. He always said, you heard the pilot, and he gave me 24 hours to decide what to do about it, or to go do it anyway, or not do it. But he always gave me that latitude. So it gave us an opportunity to think out what we were doing. And you never were pressured, even though probably I was the most pressured at that. I hated just sitting around waiting for, it was not a fast moving business. Research never is, And in those days, we had no truck with publicity or that sort of thing. It was beneath us. We were technical people. We were research people. We didn't need all those flocks screwing around with us. But that thing was changing pretty fast about early 1950s. And we were approaching the McNamara era where everything had to be very carefully orchestrated in an fishbowl. And so it was fun. And we then flew 11 research airplanes in the early 50s with 70 people, all up, including the janitors, out of one hangar at the South Base at Edwards. And never been duplicated because we were on our own doing what we thought we could do and didn't have to clear it with anybody and weren't worried about making a mistake in front of the public. That's been the biggest inhibition on progress that I think anything that's happened since World War II. And as an aside, that generation that came out of the Depression and World War II was very remarkable. And what we did with technology after the war, during the war, and after the war was really no precedent in history for it. But the bureaucracy that generation built, there's been no precedent for. We even made the Russians look like bikers. Still are. So, and that's really the big burden that everything is carrying.
Did your background as an engineer give you kind of a leg up on most of the other pilots?
Yes and no. In the first place, it would be a criticism of the other pilots if I said it did, but that was the beginning of the era when almost all test pilots required to have an aeronautical or an engineering degree and that sort of thing. Things were changing then. Actually, Eddie Allen, who was an NACA pilot in the early 20s, was a legitimate doctor in his own right, and so was Jim Doolittle. And that really was where the precedent came from. After the war, we had a lot of goggles and flying scarf fighter pilots who were doggone good aviators and did most of the test flying, but really didn't wholly participate in the analysis and determination of what that was doing. During the 50s, that all changed. And at that time, the Air Force had a very strong inclination to want to be in on first flights and all of that. They soon found that wasn't their business. Huh? They were weapon system evaluators and not engineers. And so that came and went. And from then on, though, almost all Air Force and civilian test pilots were degreed engineers.
What makes a great test pilot?
I don't know what makes a beautiful woman, huh? I don't know. Test pilots, I've seen them. They're tall and slim and short and fat. And they're just all kinds. I never did know what made a fighter pilot, and I trained hundreds of them. I never could anticipate by getting to know a student, whether he was going to be good, bad, or indifferent. I never did know whether you had to push them or pull them or make them mad at you to make them do their best. I did know that the only thing I could do to make them do their best, it's the best I could do for them. Well, test pilots, it's got a lot of press and a lot of movies and a lot of stuff, but it's a good professional way to close the circle of engineering, from concept all the way through the 7 steps to a finished product. Never before did we close it in engineering. We gave it to a pilot to see if it would work, and now it closed the circle. It's a dangerous business. If you claim that you never got scared, you're a liar and you shouldn't be a test pilot. You didn't have good sense. If you admitted you got scared, you probably shouldn't be a test pilot either, except to yourself. And, it took an immense amount of concentration to not make those mistakes that very often could be fatal.
In the public's mind, I think test pilots are, excuse me, they're viewed as daredevils, but it's exactly the opposite, isn't it?
It became that way. Originally, right after the war, or well, not necessarily all the time, because certainly the Wrights were good test pilots, the best in the world, weren't they? And they weren't daredevils, but they dared. And this is all the way up through the men who really carried aviation on its back when it had no precedent, no basis. And in fact, we did much better before we had a history than we've done since we had a history. But out of World War II, of course, there were a lot of guys came out of the war still hyped up from the war, and a lot of them became test pilots. And some of the best pilots in both military services, that's the route they chose to take. They were inclined to be, I want to put it right, they weren't daredevils because they had good sense and they knew what they were doing. It is to be less introspective into what they were doing, and they wanted to fly. They loved to fly. That's probably one of the things that's a criteria for a test pilot. If he doesn't like to fly, he's got no business doing that kind of work. And then test pilots are all different too. Testing is a pretty broad profession. The work I was doing was so-called research, where we were finding out what the aerodynamics of different configurations of airplanes were. Test flying for a corporation was to see if our latest attempt to use all of those data and make a useful, applicable device that's a different thing. It's a demonstration of our engineering rather than a seeking of engineering parameters.
Like you were the first pilot to, at least unofficially, go past Mach 3?
Unofficially, yeah. I knew Joe Walker was going to try it within a week or two, and so I had the opportunity, and I bumped that Mach meter up against Mach 3, and I didn't dare tell anybody because that's very unprofessional. One, trying to steal another guy's plan, and two, doing what you didn't have on your flight plan. I'd fire a pilot that did that.
What was it like?
Nothing, just a number on a dial. I'm not even sure the number was good because in those days we didn't have all that good of instruments. We should have, the instruments that were recording the stuff in the X-15, which is what I did it in, would have determined it. But what I got from the Mach meter in the cockpit probably was Mach 3. But I just did it so I could have that personal satisfaction. I didn't admit it for a long time.
Do you ever look back on those days and say, boy, I'm lucky to be alive right now. I did some crazy things or things I didn't even know were crazy at the time?
I never dwelled on it in that regard. I knew the hazards of aviation. Of course, I lost an awful lot of friends in airplanes because it's really all I've been involved in, particularly during the war. But aviation's not as dangerous as you'd like it. I was the engineering officer of a training squadron as a collateral duty in World War II down Corpus Christi. And in my tour in that squadron, we flew 550,000 hours. Now, that's a lot of hours. And we had 11 fatalities, instructors and students. When you think of that, pushing all those young people in through for the war, not letting up at all on them, that's pretty remarkable. With the research airplanes, we flew for 30 years, and we lost 5 pilots. And that's not bad. No, that's not the high hours that we're talking about. But, and every one of those were dead before they left the ground, and that is somebody made a mistake and going to do something they couldn't handle. And some of them were pretty close and lived through it. Charlie Yeager survived a couple of real close ones.
Tell me a little bit about the X-15.
Well, the X-15 was to be the natural follow-on to the X-2, which fell out of the picture pretty early. So It was a very unique kind of an airplane, and it did not have a good reputation amongst the people who had all the answers. Kelly Johnson said it would do nothing but prove the bravery of the pilot. Well, in the end, it turned out to be one of the most productive research vehicles we ever had, and probably paved a lot of ground going into space that we wouldn't have had information on. Both of the atmosphere, heating rates, aerodynamics, and all those things that it takes. The X-15 originally was planned to go 6,600 feet per second, fly 250,000 feet, and it did that. When we first proposed it, I decided that I was going to follow that airplane. I didn't want to leave the committee, but it was just such an opportunity that I made a deal with 2 or 3 of the manufacturers that I wanted to talk to them about working on the airplane during its whole development and manufacture as an engineer, and then take it into flight test. North American got it, and I got that opportunity. And I was 3 years in the design group on the X-15. I think I contributed to it. And then I took it into flight test and did the demonstration flights on it. And that was very interesting. The X-15 was like a fucking stallion, I'll tell you. It was going to kill me, or we were in a Mexican standoff for a while. But we finally broke it, and it turned out to be a good mom.
What are you most proud of in your career?
Just a good professional try. No particular thing. I'm proud of the X-15, but I can't be because so many people had so much to do with it, who none of whom could have, or all of whom would have been missed terribly. And so just seeing an opportunity, that came out of the war, and for me, what I wanted to do, and taking advantage of that as much as I could. I'd like to go back and do some of it over again, but I don't have any particular single moment.
What would you like to go back and do over again?
Oh, professionally, I think maybe I could have hung in there a little bit better. I was inclined to stand on principle when all that did was get me kicked off a program, so I couldn't do anything about what I was arguing about. That doesn't make very good sense in hindsight, does it? And a lot of people do that, I got fired 3 times, and I'm pretty proud of twice. So,
It was mostly the bureaucracy that you were fighting against?
not the bureaucracy. I don't know how to discuss those things without being negative, huh? And it serves no purpose. I got fired off of the Apollo because I stood up against NASA. And you didn't stand up against NASA, particularly if you were a customer who was getting $2 billion a year out of them. So NASA recommended North American that I be removed from the job, and I was on the Apollo. Frankly, though, I think that what we were fighting for, we won, and we got to the moon, and that was to discipline these things without any yielding to those disciplines that would guarantee that Armstrong would get back. My first battle with NASA was 3 years before the fire. We knew it was going to happen, and we fought like hell to find another way to do that ground test where we were going to have that very high total pressure of pure oxygen in that cockpit. But no, sir, NASA was going to do it their way, and I was told to shut up or get off the program. So I shut up. I regret that. And it wasn't that we were so smart, but we could demonstrate that explosion was almost inevitable. And that wasn't because we were so smart, because there had already been 2 men killed in identical circumstances, one at the School of Aviation Medicine, San Antonio, one at Wright Field. They kept that pretty quiet over the years. NASA knew that. But we had demonstrated at that time I owned all the quality control, reliability engineering, and systems test on Apollo. And we were doing an incredible job. In 3 years, we went from 3,500 to 35,000, and we're testing hardware that was going to go to the moon. And those were long, hard days. But NASA did not like to be disagreed with. And I wouldn't criticize it, but Jim Webb blamed the company for that fire. And the company fought him tooth and nail against doing that. Both the aeromedical people and those of us in engineering. I did because I didn't know how we were going to test this thing at sea level. In space, 100% oxygen atmosphere is quite safe. It's only 5 psi absolute. But on the ground, it's 5 plus 15 atmospheric. It's 20 pounds absolute, and it's a thermite bomb. So it's those kinds of things that I stood up for that got me in trouble professionally. And so finally, I just had to go to the airlines and work for them.
In terms of NASA, do you think there was too much pressure to get to the moon by the end of the 60s?
No. It was doable, and we did it. And a lot of things came up, and a lot of changes were made. It was hard to do, no question about it. No, that program was a killer, but it shows what we can do if we get a national commitment. Sometimes you wonder if we can't afford to assassinate a few more presidents so we can get national commitments, which is not a very nice way to look at it, but that's what made it so that we all work together. And when this country decides to do something and they all work together, nothing's impossible. Nothing. I don't think anything is. It would be very difficult to go back to the moon right now because it'd be a political battle for money over everything, But at those times when Jack died, well, that was his dream, and nobody dared vote against it, which is kind of good. It caught us back from our embarrassment of the Russians whipping our tail in space the way they were, with airplanes and space. They were doing an incredibly good job. First with the supersonic transport. They beat us with the Mach 3 fighter. First in space, first with an animal in space, first with a man in space. And they've had that laboratory up there in space for 20 years. So all of us bragging. Well, the going to the moon kind of tempers a lot of that. We had a bad habit all those days of being a little bit long-nosed about Russian engineering, how it was crude and all of that. I beg your pardon, they are brilliant engineers, and they proved it over and over again. When they first opened up their Shanghai laboratory in 1993, I was over there, just happened to be there, happened to go. And I'm a wind tunnel aerodynamicist by training, and really originally a profession. They had wind tunnels that NASA would give their right arm to have, and they ran them on 1/10 of the budget that NASA runs them on. They didn't have all of the flack and the publicity and the show that went with it. They had concrete block walls with awful good tools. And they had some wind tunnels that were unbelievable, still are. And nothing matches in the United States today. And they would have been a tough in a technological war. Well, they were tough. Huh?
Anything that I've left out that you think is important?
I don't know. What's important is that I wish we could get out of this moratorium where we're living on World War II, how good we were, memorabilia, museums, legends of flight, all the things you guys are doing, and start put that kind of money, time, and effort in the future. And then we would take another explosive growth. It's going to happen, but the old guys aren't going to like the way the young people do it. But they're going to do it. The computers were that kind of thing, gave us tools. The bureaucracy made us think that the computers are smarter than we were, but we'll get over that too. But if you stop and think, all of this celebrating that we do about how good we are, if we could just put that kind of money and effort in the future. But the last try I had, and it took me almost 20 years to get it off the ground and going, was the National Aerospace plane. We almost got over the hump, but we couldn't quite do it. And I got that canceled myself because I couldn't do to the taxpayer what they were doing. You know, it needed a leader, it needed a dedication, because when you do something that hard, it's like a war. You know, the leaders is surface, but we just never got far enough into it that it would work. You know, the Kelly Johnsons and the Harrison Storms and those kind of guys. And they would have surfaced, but we couldn't go so long. They were already spent $3 billion. They hadn't drawn a center line. And yet you knew it was doable. I could make it doable on my home computer. But for some reason or other, everybody wanted to make a tremendous effort out of it. Much like when we started to talk about going to the moon, everybody said we couldn't. In fact, it wasn't until Kennedy died that it really got to be a serious effort, you know, and they just said, why don't we? So if anything that we're leaving out right now, we have done nothing really in space and aeronautics in the last 30, 40 years. The space station is a godsend. I wish it were all ours. It gives us the opportunity to make sure World War III never occurs, because we can look at the Earth pretty thoroughly and know what everybody's doing. And if we don't play Chamberlain, we'll stop them. We'll have to, because the next one's going to be a mean one. Well, they're all mean. But I work a lot with aerospace education, and we were talking a little bit earlier out here with children and all that, but we're not going to push them into aviation and space. They're going to find their own way to do it. In fact, I think if we objected, they would move faster than if we tried to push them into it. That's the nature of young people, isn't it?
Magic that was there for a kid nowadays for aviation that there was when you were.
No, no way. The Dayton kid isn't sitting on a fence dreaming anymore. And you know, we could fix that. I mean, there are a lot of ways if we just had the balls to do it. But today we count the beans and we get insurance, we don't take risks, we don't do this. And if a youngster wants to learn to fly today, what does he learn to fly in? A 152. Now, what bright up-and-coming young man wants to fly in a 152? But we have little jet engines today that, I want one of those, huh? And we could make a cheap trainer below $100,000, the cost of a sports car. And but the risk, the cost, you know, that's the thing. The risk, nobody's willing to take a professional or a monetary risk this day and age. And the history of aviation are people going broke because their heart, you know, led way out in front. If you go to the Air and Space Museum, just stand in that foyer, look at all the heart that's in there. And not much of that costs much money. I can give an example, and that is that the research airplane program was 30 years up through the X-15. There's about 30 variations of about 13 or 14 basic configurations. The whole cost of all that hardware and the operations over that 30 years was less than $500 million. $500 million, less than $500 million. You couldn't bid on one of those today. All of the reports that came out of the X-15 might be that thick. You bid today would be that thick to make an X-15. And that's what was beginning to happen to the aerospace plane. It was doable. You could prove analytically that while there are a lot of things we had to learn, just like with the X-15 and the Apollo and everything else, we could do it. But you have to do it with a lot of heart in it. And we've changed quite a bit. It used to be that a general would say, hey, do that, and he'd do it. But today he has to ask his colonels to study it, and then he has to follow their recommendation. And that's no way to run a ball game, I don't think. We could do an awful lot in aviation right now if we just made up our mind and go do it. And here I'm sitting here talking about it. Probably I should be doing it too. Well, the National Aerospace Plan was, we put out the first contract in 1986. And it was to be an effort to make an orbital turnaround vehicle that would go to space as an air breather. About 78% of the load lifted off of the Cape Canaveral on the space shuttle is oxygen, and it's to be had for free in the atmosphere. You know, every engine we have, except rockets, uses Earth's atmosphere to breathe. If we could do that, we could reduce the cost of going to space by maybe 2 orders of magnitude. Instead of $1,400 or $140, maybe $14 a pound. And it was a dream of a lot of us to now sophisticate all we'd learned through the brutishness of rocket technology, which is the only way we could do it. So we had a scheme for an air-breathing airplane that would take off from a runway, fly to orbit, and you count as an air breather. People say, oh, there's no air up there, but there are ways to do this. Even if we did have to use rockets, and I would have accepted that, the last 3 or 4 Mach numbers, that's okay too, and return. And that would be kind of make the space station and the space shuttle really be meaningful. So we'd have some alacrity and flexibility and turnaround capability to go into space. And really, NASA was interested in Mars, and other people were talking about going to the moon. And I kind of think our problems here on Earth to solve these problems first. Cislunar space is where we're going to really get the advantage of these new technology. We've already got a tremendous advantage from it. Well, the aerospace plane was supposed to do that, and one of the derivatives was a Mach 5 transport. What Reagan called or used our name, the Orient Express. I don't remember that. It would take aerospace plane technology to do the Orient Express, and it was very attractive in that you could fly from New York to Beijing in under 2 hours. And actually, it turned out to be very good economically because, you know, time and speed is really where the economics come into this thing. But that didn't get very far. It did a lot of good, though, because my scheme was that we ought to be a nation against the world, much as Russia was, rather than a company against the world. So why not muster an alliance of all of our major airframe manufacturers to build a national aerospace plane? Then we get the benefit of all of the talent and input in the country, with a tremendous financial base to make it possible. We did that with materials. The phase 1 was just to look at all of the materials. And all of the engineering people from the 5 major manufacturers got together, and we had quantum leaps in our understanding of materials. High solidification ratio metals, you know, some of these glass metals that we had, controlling the structure, the crystal structure of metals and all of that. We just started a whole new world of materials. Carbon fibers are one of those things, and look at what we're getting out of carbon fiber material today, compound materials. And that worked pretty well, and everybody got together and shared it. And in that scheme, no company was barred from doing what they wanted, but each one of them had a main aim to take care of, you know, whether it be metals, organic materials, or whatever it was. Well, when we tried to do the aerospace plane, we had the 5 industries got together, and it was led by North American, which would have been a good leader, but they didn't put an engineer in charge. They put a Harvard MBA in charge. That was, I shouldn't be that critical, but nevertheless, the companies got to arguing about, well, you got the last engineering decision, let's vote. I want the next one. Well, you don't do that. And that was this bureaucracy working. And actually, they spent an awful lot of money and weren't getting anywhere. And so I talked to the congressman I was working with on this thing at the time. I was a technical advisor at Congress at that time. Told him, hey, let's cancel this. We can't do this to the taxpayer, you know. $3 billion before you get started, you know, and it would have been as expensive maybe as Apollo. But the results would have been well worthwhile. We would have shrunk the Earth down to size. We would have had a lot of commerce in space, not just one space station that we try to get money out of Russia to help us build, and that sort of thing. But everyone had their own axe to grind rather than Takes a leader, a real leader, to lead a thing like that, and he didn't surface. That's really what.
Are we the same country? Do we have the same national character and national spirit that won World War II that could do the test pilot program, or has it all been lost?
Yeah, it's always been difficult to motivate this country. This goes from the Revolutionary War through the Civil War, the Spanish-American War. We've always been, you know, we can get together again to do anything. And we've had an awful lot of large immigration here since, say, Cuba and all of that. We've got, again, the best of the world in that. We're ready to do anything, and we can. That was a mistake that Hitler kind of seemed to think, that we were decadent, you know, and we weren't going to be able to stand up to him. Well, he got his arse whipped, and we can do that again if necessary, and we're in a position to do it. Yes, we are the same country, though they're an awful. Nothing's perfect, I guess. This country's not perfect. It was constructed so that it's virtually indestructible as a system. And that's because, incidentally, 3 engineers designed the country: Washington, Jefferson, and Franklin. And they did. They used the engineering method. I could just lay out how we build our country to the engineering method. So when one part gets a little weak, the other parts can carry it. But it had its problems. Certainly, there was not a union in the 1860s, huh? And there's still not a union. But when we go to war, we go to war, and we'll win it. I wish we could go to war with the technology that's there for us to do, because, you know, and use this computer here. These computers, they're good tools, but the real computer is the inventive mind, isn't it? And it can take us a long way into what we would like to do. We have done that. We don't take advantage of it. We try to kill ourselves. For instance, nobody ever thought that the Middle West, that dry country, would be the world's breadbasket, huh? We made it that way, one plowshare at a time. And we've done that with industry. Yet we've given all that industry away, sometimes foolishly, sometimes through just decisions made by people who thought they knew what they were talking about. As Jimmy Carter gave away the carbon fiber business to Japan through a rather presumptuous, patronizing attitude that he knew all there was to know about engineering. We knew it was happening. There wasn't a thing we could do about it. And if we just quit, you know, doing those dumb things, we never will. We'll always manage. So I'm not a pessimist about this country at all. There's a lot of negative, but there's an awful lot positive going for us. And as I mentioned earlier, I've lectured from Miami to Seattle and from Caltech to MIT, and this is the smartest generation we've ever had. The last couple of generations, I guess I've outlived 2 or 3 of them. And I'm hoping to just kick all the old guys out, start doing it their way. Because, you know, the example isn't what you follow. I'm lecturing now. Those people that say people that ignore history are bound to repeat it, that's a bunch of baloney. The more we learn about history, the more we're bound to repeat it. It's the way we've always done it, huh? Look, it worked before, why doesn't it work now? One of the best things we had at Edwards were the research airplanes, where we were all young, everybody in their 30s or less. We had really virtually no boss, because we were doing what there was no precedent, no rules, no regulations, anything for. So we did what came naturally. We just made things work. And I think that early on this country did that, but we have kind of bogged ourselves down, and we're the last great socialist republic in the world. And that'll break. We'll get over that. I think people will make it work.
I interviewed Paul Tibbets last year.
Oh, yeah?
He is and he was funny. He didn't want to do the interview. And
He's not too anxious to get publicity.
so he said, I asked him one question, and he talked for about a half hour. He just went through everything. So that was the hearing wasn't much of a factor.
He's got selective hearing. He hears you.